Bem, muito bom dia para todas e para todos. Bem-vindos, bem-vindas à Aula Aberta do Grupo de Pesquisa Teoria do Direito, da Academia Prática, do nosso programa de pós-graduação em Direito da FMP. E hoje nós temos, então, a oportunidade de receber convidados muito distintos para discutir um tema que é de interesse de todos. Tá? Nós temos hoje o professor Gilberto Morbach, que vai ser incluído aqui conosco. O professor Gilberto é doutor e mestre em Direito, summa cum laude, bolsista do CNPq pela Unicinos, foi pesquisador visitante junto ao Cambridge Forum for Legal and Political Philosophy da Universidade de Cambridge e atualmente pesquisador de pós-doutorado como bolsista da FAPESP no Departamento de Filosofia e Teoria Geral do Direito da Faculdade de Direito da USP. E, então, eu dou as boas-vindas para o Gilberto. Gilberto, seja muito bem-vindo, tu és da casa, meu amigo. E nós temos hoje Por favor.
Obrigado pelo convite, professor Francisco. É uma honra enorme estar aqui. Eu já me sinto um amigo da FMP, graças aos teus convites, que muito me honram. E estou particularmente feliz aqui pela oportunidade de estar discutindo um tema que me é muito caro contigo, que é um professor que eu muito respeito e admiro, um amigo querido. E seguimos com o nosso convidado aí.
Obrigado, Gilberto. Gilberto que vai co-ancorar aqui o evento comigo e, né, nós todos aqui estamos de verdade reunidos para receber o professor David Dyzenhaus, que está aqui nos bastidores, professor de Direito e Filosofia da Universidade de Toronto, Fellow da Royal Society of Canada e Corresponding Fellow da British Academy, é doutor pela Universidade de Oxford e autor de diversos trabalhos influentes, como Hard Cases in Wicked Legal Systems, The South African Law and Perspective of Legal Philosophy, e mais recentemente, The Long Arc of Legality, Hobbes, Kelsen and Hart, que é o tema da nossa discussão hoje. Então, antes de conversar com o professor David e de passar a palavra para ele, só explicar rapidamente como isso vai funcionar. O professor David vai fazer uma lecture, vai fazer uma exposição a respeito de temas relacionados ao Long Arc of Legality, e depois nós vamos ter a oportunidade de nos engajarmos com ele em discussão. Nós lemos o Long Arc of Legality no meu grupo de pesquisa ao longo desse semestre, então nós temos diversas questões que gostaríamos de discutir com ele, e havendo interesse também da assistência, vocês podem mandar as perguntas ali em inglês ou em português, que o Gilberto e eu vamos procurar contemplá-las na conversa que se segue com o professor David. Certo? So, Professor David Dyzenhaus, we are so happy to have you here with us. Thank you so much for taking the time. You're such a huge reference for all of us. Your book is extremely challenging. It's a great book. I congratulate you on the achievement. It deals with a lot of issues that we would like to discuss with you later on, but that's enough for me. We'll talk about this later. I just want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. It's truly an honor, and on behalf of the research group that I coordinate and the law school where I teach, we thank you very, very much. The floor is yours, Professor David.
Thank you very much. So can you see my slides now, or? I don't
Not yet. Not yet. Os slides, estou perguntando aqui para o pessoal do...
We had them up before. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. There we go.
There we have them. Yeah, perfect.
Great. So you spoke about it being an honor for you to have me with you from Berlin in Sao Paulo, but actually the honor is all mine, because I think it's really wonderful that a group in Brazil will spend all the time struggling through the 488 pages of this book. So I'm delighted to be here. And I have prepared a lecture, as we were discussing before. I'm much more interested in what those of you who've struggled through my book have to tell me about the book and to try to answer questions which you might have, then I am in presenting the lecture. So I'm going to actually go through this lecture fairly fast, just to give you a sense of the book. And the lecture is based on a paper that I've written since the book, trying to take the argument a little bit further. And perhaps I won't dwell too much on the bits that try to take the argument a bit further, but rather take you quite quickly to a few of the slides where I actually try to present part of the argument of the book in pictures. And I think these pictures, which I didn't put together myself, I have no talent in this regard, but I paid a friend of my son's to do this, are actually quite helpful for trying to understand the argument of the book. So the first slide, you'll all be familiar with this cover, but I thought I would put it there anyway. And one of the reasons I really like this cover is it actually portrays a street scene in central Berlin in the early 1930s. It's called Friedrichstrasse. It's by an artist called Georg Gross, a wonderful artist who was one of the people the Nazis labeled as a degenerate artist because of his work during Weimar. So where I start is with someone whose name is, I think, familiar to everyone in Brazil who's interested in philosophy of law, but he's hardly known in the English world. His political theory is not known, but his political theory is known, but not his philosophy of law. And I've actually been working on a project in the last several months with an Italian, trying to bring Norberto Bobbio's work to the attention of Anglo-American philosophers of law. And there's this wonderful line in one of Bobbio's essays, which I think for me captures my understanding of philosophy of law. And there you have it. The legal experience is a normative experience. And it struck me when I read this line that all of my time as an academic, I've been trying to make sense of something like this idea that the legal experience is a normative experience. For those of you who recall H.L.A. Hart's lecture in 1958, Positivism and the Separation of Law and Morals, Hart says there at a certain point, distancing himself from his positivist tradition, that law is surely not the gunman situation writ large. So what is law? Law is a normative experience, it's an experience of norms, but that idea is actually something that's very difficult to make sense of. So the bit I'm going to start skipping over is the paper was written for a workshop on Judith Sklar and her book, The Faces of Injustice, and her insight that within the framework of all legal orders, you will find that injustice thrives. So what does it mean to take that into account? Sklar, my slides seem to have come out rather peculiarly on this on the streaming service. But anyway, Sklar says that without juridical institutions and the beliefs that support them, there can be no decent, just, or stable social relations, but only anxiety, mutual mistrust, and I don't even know whether it appears on the slide, and insecurity. Does insecurity appear on the slide? Anyway, it doesn't matter. And there you have a picture of your court in Sao Paulo. This second insight of Sklar's, that without juridical institutions we have no trust, security, etc., is, in my view, a very Hobbesian insight. And Hobbes is perhaps the most important figure in the history of political theory for me, which is why he figures in the subtitle of my book. And Hobbes has this idea in Leviathan, which I find very intriguing, that law is the artificial chains that the sovereign subjects have themselves fastened at one end to the lips of the man or assembly to whom they have given the sovereign power, and at the other end to their own ears. And I think this idea of the artificial chains that stretch from the sovereign subjects to the lips of the sovereign does bring legal subjects into philosophy of law in a very interesting way, because it raises the question, which is a big question for philosophy of law: what role do subjects play in constituting sovereign authority? Here's the line I quoted earlier from Hart: law surely is not the gunman situation writ large. And Hart, in distancing himself from his positivist predecessors, was mostly thinking of John Austin, the 19th century legal positivist, and his command model of law. And this is the first of my pictures, and you see the command model of law on this slide. It's a very simple model of law. You have the sovereign issues commands to the subjects, and then you have enforcers or officials who enforce the commands. And I want you to notice here, it's hard to notice an absence, but there's something absent here, which we'll see in some of the later slides. That is, there's no line around the picture. So, and that's to give you the sense that in Austin, the sovereign is legally unlimited. There are no legal constraints on sovereignty. You just have the sovereign unlimited by law, issuing commands to subjects. Then those commands get enforced on subjects who fail to comply with the law. Hart, as I'm sure you all know, in making his move away from the simple command model of law, the principal intuition that he has in making this move is to introduce the idea of the rule of recognition. And I started off in my undergraduate classes trying to convey to second-year students this idea of the rule of recognition. And I came up with this idea on the slide, which I now use in practically all of my talks. So you imagine a very simple society, right? So you have a sovereign who makes law, and in order to make law, the sovereign has to write the laws on a notice board in the town square. And so if you want to know as a subject what the law is, there's a rule of recognition there. You know how to recognize law. You look to what's written on the notice board in the town square. And then Hart wanted us to notice something about the sovereign. The sovereign is no longer legally unlimited, at least in that in order to make law, the sovereign has to comply with one rule, that is, write the laws down on the notice board. So this is Hart's major move away from John Austin's command model of law. Now we get to, and Gilberto was asking me whether we could talk about Lon Fuller. Of course, we should talk about Lon Fuller, one of my favorite philosophers of law. Fuller, as you'll know, had this very powerful challenge, at least I think it's powerful, to Hart. That is, if the sovereign wants to make law, if the sovereign wants to rule by law, the sovereign has to do a lot more than comply with a rule of recognition. In order for law to work, law also has to comply with what Fuller thought of as principles of legality. Law has to be general, it has to be public or promulgated. You can't have too much retroactive law. And just skipping through to the last, there has to be congruence between official action and declared rule. That is, the officials who enforce the law must actually enforce the law. They can't just do as they please. And Fuller thought that if you have a legal order that complies by and large with these principles of legality, and he thought that if a legal order failed to comply, it would cease to be legal after a while. If it so complies, then you will get what he called the morality of law. And this is the controversial claim in Fuller. Philosophers of law, including, I think, all legal positivists, basically accept most of Fuller's challenge. That is, they say, of course, if a ruler wishes to rule through law, the ruler is going to have to comply with something like Fuller's principles of legality. What they deny is that that creates any moral quality to the law. And that's what Fuller wanted to affirm, that there's an inner morality of law, what he called a bond of reciprocity, and a claim that he made late in this book, The Morality of Law, that every departure from the principles of the law's inner morality is an affront to man's dignity as a responsible agent. Now, with this slide, I think we get a complete picture of the debate in Anglo-American philosophy of law. And I call the first picture Rule of Law State 1, Hart. So this is Hart having accepted Fuller's challenge. So what we get is the sovereign who makes law in accordance with Fuller's principles of legality, as well as putting the law on the notice board. When officials enforce the law, they comply with various procedural principles. And now we get the line that was missing in the first picture I offered you of Austin's command theory. You get a thick line around the whole of the legal space. And that tells one that what we have in place is something like the rule of law. Officials are, and including those who staff the sovereign office, have to act within the law in order to make law. So one has something like the rule of law. You can contrast that with what's on the other side of the slide, and that is rule of law state 2, which is Fuller's understanding. And I think the only real difference between the Fullerian understanding of the rule of law and the legal positivist or Hartian understanding is the element in Fuller, rule of law state 2, where you have this two-way arrow between the sovereign and the subjects. Because Fuller's claim, in a nutshell, is that if you put all of that furniture in place in a legal order, the sovereign, the formal principles, the notice board, the officials, including judges, the procedural principles, and so on, what you'll get is what Fuller called a bond of reciprocity between subjects and sovereign, and the subjects then play a role in constituting the authority of the sovereign. I think really that is the debate in philosophy of law over the last, 60 or so years. Now, the challenge that Judith Sklar, a great American political theorist, presented to Fuller is practically the same challenge as the legal positivist critique of Fuller. And that is, she claimed that Fuller's inner morality is perfectly compatible with governments of a most repressive and irrational sort. She said the very formal rationality of a civil law system can legitimize a persecutive war state among those officials who are charged with maintaining the private law in its clients. And she said that this was certainly the case in Nazi Germany. And she cited in support of this claim about Nazi Germany having been a system that was consistent with the rule of law, the work of a great German lawyer, Ernst Frankl, who wrote a book called The Dual State in the late 30s and translated into English in the 40s. And Sklar cites this work on the Nazi state as one of the few older studies of the Third Reich that remains valid. And I think here Sklar goes badly wrong. So I don't know how familiar people are with Frankl's The Dual State. It was reissued by Oxford University Press a few years ago. And the reason that it was reissued is that Frankl's analysis in The Dual State actually seems highly relevant today. And I'd be interested to know whether people, at least in this audience in Brazil, find Frankl's analysis relevant. When I've talked to other audiences in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, they have indeed thought that Frankl's idea is relevant. So this is the way that Frankl understood the Nazi state. He said it was two states were side by side. On the one side was what he called the normative state, and the normative state was what survived from before 1933. So the legal order of Weimar and the remnants of the rule of law. And on the other side was the prerogative state. And in the prerogative state, Nazi officials just did whatever they thought was appropriate, whatever was in the interests of the Nazi party. And as I understand Frankl's analysis, in this kind of order, the sovereign is in the prerogative state because officials in the prerogative state can overrule any decision in the normative state as they please. And so what we get is we get the thick line around part of the normative state, as we saw with the rule of law state. But there's a broken line around the prerogative state because the sovereign in the prerogative state is legally unlimited. And what's more, there's a broken line in between the normative state and the prerogative state. Why? Because the sovereign can intervene in the normative state at will. And Frankl thus concluded that there was no rule of law in Germany, just because everything was at the disposal, as it were, of Nazi officials. In one of the introductions to an edition of Frankl's book, he describes his legal practice in Berlin, which was from 33 until 38, as that of a switchman. So what did he mean by switchman? He meant a railway switchman, that is the person who switches trains from one track to another. And his work was, as a lawyer, was not really legal work. It mostly was work that hinged on trying to ensure that matters stayed within the normative state, did not end up in the prerogative state. Here's the little tablet that commemorates Frankl in Berlin and where he lived and worked. And Frankel was a very interesting figure. There's a whole book written about him by Douglas Morris, which is worth reading, about his practice in Berlin between 33 and 38. He was both a Jewish and a very active socialist politician. And so you might wonder how he was able to practice law in Berlin. He was able to do that because there was an exemption for Jews who were mostly kicked out of the professions in 33. If you had served in the German army during the First World War, you could continue to practice. By 1938, Frankel is in despair about being a lawyer in Berlin, and he leaves for New York, which was probably a good thing for him, because otherwise he probably would have ended up in a concentration camp. So there we have Frankel. And Frankel's idea of the dual state is, I think, a key to legal theory. Why? Because we can describe all legal orders, I think, as sitting somewhere on what I call the continuum of legality. And at the one end of the continuum of legality, we have something like an ideal rule of law state. And then at various points along this continuum, we have other legal orders. And so I have there the apartheid state, that is the state where I grew up and was educated, the parallel state, which I'll get to in a minute, and also, and I might not spend any time on this, the pre-Civil War US. And the point of this slide is to show you that the dual state is off the continuum. Remember that Frankel says that there was no rule of law in Nazi Germany because the officials in the prerogative state, the Nazi officials, could intervene in the affairs of the normative state at any time. And my claim is that if you're somewhere on the continuum of legality, so in some kind of rule of law state, even if the rule of law is very precarious in that state, that does provide a resource to lawyers to resist oppression and discrimination. So where I've moved to now is the state that I call the parallel state. And I highly recommend the book that appears on the slide to you. It's by one of the leading human rights lawyers in Israel, a Jewish Israeli called Michael Svard, who does most of his work in the occupied territories. And he's written this book, The Wall and the Gate, about his human rights practice in the occupied territories. I should mention that this paper and what I'm about to say was all put together well before October 7th, and so I make no claims about the legal situation there now. Svard in this book about the practice of human rights lawyering in the occupied territories deals at length with what he calls the paradox of human rights lawyering. And the paradox is that human rights lawyers have to struggle with the fact that winning lots of legal victories may not only affect the bad regime that leads to the policy, but may not only not affect the bad regime that leads to the policy, but even serve to legitimize it. And that's, I think, a very interesting observation, because if you as a practicing human rights lawyer know that many of your victories will not actually make that much difference to the regime, but also will serve to legitimize the regime, because the regime can say, hey, we have all of these human rights lawyers working within the legal order, so we can't be all that bad. This shows that we still respect the rule of law. Therefore, it is the case that human rights lawyers do legitimize the regime. And Svard said that's because in any legal order, legal norms do not only dictate, they also justify. So there is always some justification available, even within a highly oppressive legal order, such as existed in the occupied territories, at least at the time that Svard was writing. I'm not sure that there's any legal order in existence there anymore. Svard takes a lot of inspiration from the legal order, which I first learned about as a law student, and that's the legal order of apartheid. And here you have the cover of the second edition of my first book, which was mentioned in the very generous introduction to me at the beginning, Hard Cases in Wicked Legal Systems. So I wrote my doctorate, which then became this book, on the practice of judges during the apartheid period in South Africa, and trying to draw lessons from that practice for philosophy of law. And I like this photo, not only because it's on the cover of my book, but because it gives you a very vivid picture of one apartheid law. If you look at the sign, you can't read all of the sign. it says whites only on one side, and then it just has the same in Afrikaans on the other side. And you see this little black kid who's just playing, trying to climb up the slide. So the sign, I think that's very evocative because, and maybe this will be something that's familiar to people in Brazil, I don't know. If you look at the suburb behind, to a South African, it's absolutely clear that the houses in the background, these big luxurious houses, are houses that belong to whites. And then you can have that affirmed by seeing the whites only sign. So let me just say something quick about the apartheid state, which a legal order that I still find fascinating. In the apartheid state, you have this legal framework around the whole space. You have the sovereign, the parliament making law. Throughout the apartheid period, there were general norms that applied to all South Africans, including the oppressed and discriminated against black majority. And what the apartheid laws did was that they carved out vast exceptions to these general norms. So the spaces of discrimination were in a way large carve-outs from the legal order. And that had a very interesting implication. It meant that because in principle, the general norms of the legal order still applied to people who have been discriminated against and oppressed. They were what I call second-class citizens. They had 1 foot in second-class space, 1 foot in first-class space. And that allowed throughout the apartheid era, human rights lawyers to use the law, as I like to put it, against the law. Law always provided a resource for human rights lawyers to try to resist the very oppression and injustice that was visited on the black majority by the law. There was a space within the general legal framework that I want to draw your attention to, and that's the prerogative space. So when it comes to the political opposition to apartheid, the government dealt with that political opposition by passing ever more severe security laws until the point where an official could detain anyone that the official considered to be a threat to national security indefinitely. That person could get no access to a lawyer or to a physician during the time of detention. And so that person was put in a space that was kind of, but not altogether beyond the law. So it was a bit like the prerogative space of the dual state, but it remained within the law, and that allowed lawyers to bring challenges even despite the legislation that put people into that space. And talking over a couple of times to people in Brazil about this, I understand that during the dictatorship, there were lawyers who were very clever lawyers who were able to make ingenious arguments when people were put in detention in order to try to either get them out of detention or to stop them being tortured. And I would think that if that was the case, if you could go to a court and get that kind of argument accepted by a judge, that you didn't have a dual state, rather you had a prerogative space, a very problematic space within the legal order. I'm going to skip over the pre-Civil War US, and maybe I'll just quickly move to the parallel state. So this is the state that exists between Israel and its occupied territories. And another very interesting legal space, I think. Why? Because the way that law works in the parallel state is not that you have general norms that are applicable to the Palestinians who live in the occupied territories. Rather, you have norms that are filtered from international law and constitutional law through administrative law and then applied by the Supreme Court to the Palestinians, or at least to their scrutiny of what the army does when it comes to managing the occupation. So you don't have a situation where you have, formally speaking, second-class citizens, because Palestinians don't have 1 foot in second-class space, 1 foot, another foot in the first-class space. But Palestinians in the occupied territories are in a virtual second-class citizen position, and that's because of the settlers. So the settlers in the occupied territories are regarded as, they are Israeli citizens, but they're regarded as entitled to the full protection of Israeli constitutional law. So in any legal dispute between the Palestinians and the settlers, in a way the Palestinians are doomed to lose. Why? Because they have this kind of very thin law that applies to them, filtered by the Israeli Supreme Court through administrative law, whereas the settlers get the full protection of the Israeli constitutional law. And that then gives us a very different situation from the situation in the apartheid state, which is why if I go back to my continuum of legality, I actually put the parallel state further along the continuum than the apartheid state, because I think the apartheid state was better, legally speaking, than the parallel state. So where I'm going to end up is with the slide that you've already seen, which is the debate in philosophy of law. And I think that what one can get out of looking at these different kinds of legal state, which is something that I do in chapter 5 of my book, The Politics of Legal Space, is that even in a state that's very far along the continuum of legality, but hasn't fallen off altogether, as the dual state did, it will be the case that there is some kind of bond of reciprocity between the sovereign and the subjects, in that lawyers who are minded to do so, so the lawyers that are called human rights lawyers, will find a resource in the law that enables them to challenge discriminatory and oppressive laws. Bringing those challenges is problematic, as Swart tells us, because through their practice, those human rights lawyers do legitimize the system. And a very interesting question for me, which I haven't fully pursued yet, is whether the legal subjects in being represented by those lawyers in court themselves legitimize the system. And that is an intriguing, but I think highly problematic idea, because it would have the following implication. If a desperate Palestinian in the occupied territories goes to a lawyer like Swart and asks Swart to represent the Palestinian in court in some matter, is that Palestinian thereby participating in legitimizing the system which that person regards as highly oppressive and unjust? And I think the answer to that question probably has to be yes. And I think there might be something very interesting there for philosophy of law. But let me stop there and maybe get rid of these slides if I can, and just take whatever questions people want to throw at me. So it's up to someone else now to get us going again.
Tá, vamos voltar aqui. Certo. Pode ser também desligado ali a apresentação. So, Professor David, thank you very much for your talk. It was illuminating. It raises a lot of questions that we would like to discuss with you. And before I give it to Gilberto in order to engage more substantially with the arguments expounded in your book, I would, if Gilberto allows me, would like just to pose a brief question, which is about the cover of the book. You have mentioned the cover of the book briefly, but before we dig deeper into the questions and controversies raised by the argument, could you please give us an extra word about the cover of the book? Because how important it is, behold the man, the sentence. And why is it that you think that the legal subject's perspective was somewhat neglected by some of the leading legal philosophers, somewhat neglected in the debate of philosophy of law?
Yeah, so there are two questions there, but I actually think, and I think this is why you asked them together, I think there is a connection between the two. So the one is just, what's the story behind the cover? And the other is, well, what about the legal subject, and why is the legal subject neglected? So the story behind the cover actually starts in Berlin, as the cover does. And I'm 8 years ago, I was at a place called the Wissenschaftskolleg du Berlin. I don't know whether people know about this. It's an institute of higher learning in Berlin. And if you're lucky enough, as I was, to get a position here, then you have a year to do your own work. And I'm actually doubly lucky because I'm now back at the Wissenschaftskolleg. You can't come back a second time, but I'm very fortunate to be married to someone who managed to come back as a fellow, so I'm here as a spouse, not as a fellow. But when I was a fellow, there was a permanent fellow here. They have a few permanent fellows, an Israeli philosopher called Avishai Margalit. I don't know whether you've encountered this philosopher. He's a fascinating philosopher, Avishai Margalit, well in his 80s now. And he actually gave me the idea of behold a man, eke homo. And he gave me this idea twice, once inadvertently, once in a lecture he gave here on dignity, and once through just talking about this idea in the history of ideas of eke homo. And so what is eke homo? It's behold a man. There is a human being in front of me, and I have to take note of this individual as a human being. And that for me is the legal subject. When the law exercises power over an individual, the law, on my account, has to take account of that individual as a human individual, as someone, as Fuller put it, with dignity, someone who should be treated as a responsible agent, shouldn't be just treated as an instrument of some policy. Now this idea is highly controversial in philosophy of law, because in a way positivist philosophers of law say, well, something like, well, that's a nice idea, but there's something deeply troubling about it, because we have to notice that the law is often used as an instrument of oppression, discrimination, persecution. And often the law does treat people as if they were things. So that the slide I skipped over, and happy to talk more about this issue, is the slide that deals with pre-Civil War US, and the problem that's fascinated me there are fugitive slaves. So these were enslaved people who managed to escape from southern states to northern states where slavery had been abolished. There was a Fugitive Slave Act, which required that these people be rendered back from the north to the south. But when they appeared in court in a summary proceeding, where the determination would be made whether to send them back to the south or not, there was a question: is this a human being in front of me? Or is this a thing that someone owns and the property should be returned? And I think law should make vivid that kind of question, and philosophy of law should explain why that is a central question for philosophy of law. And what has intrigued me as I've thought more and more about this is just the extent to which philosophy of law ignores this issue. So I find it very interesting that when Hart says in 1958, law is surely not the gunman situation writ large, and then proceeds to develop an account of law as a matter of authority, not just as coercion. And then Joseph Raz takes this project even further. Somehow the legal subject is left out of this picture altogether. And the authority relationship is a relationship only between the officials and the supreme legal authority, the sovereign. And yet at times you can see the legal subject starting to creep into the gaze of these philosophers of law, but somehow they then manage to shunt the legal subject aside. So the claim, as you'll know, that I make in the book, and whether I successfully vindicate this claim or not is another matter, is that as soon as you start embarking on the project of trying to explain law as a matter of authority, so law isn't merely coercion, the legal subject has to come into view. And then how to make sense of the legal subject within the gaze of philosophy of law becomes very, very interesting.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for that. Gilberto, you can have the floor now.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Dyzenhaus. It was a great lecture, a great talk. And my questions are very much in line with Professor Francisco's question and your response to it. Pretty much, I am very much in agreement with everything you say in your normative project, in your theorizing. I do believe that, well, Lon Fuller is actually a personal favorite of mine. I'm not saying anything here to pretend that what I research is interesting. It's just as a prelude to my question. I have two brief comments before just first in response to something you asked during your talk, yes, there has been a recent revitalization of Frankel here in Brazil. There's been a recent translation of his work into Portuguese. I think it was 2023 of the dual state. So there's been a recent interest in Frankel's theory. Also, a brief comment I'd like to make is that you mentioned that you're there as not as a scholar but as a spouse now. And the book I read before I read The Long Arc of Legality was the biography of Frank Ramsey, written by someone I'm sure you know. So it was also a very interesting read as well. My question relates, I know these are all loose thoughts, but I want to bring together this idea of Frankel's dual state to your reclaiming of Fuller's jurisprudence, which I think is largely correct. I endorse all your claims about Fuller. I think you also have the right way to understand Fuller, because I think if you only understand Fuller's 8 principles of morality, you can very well instrumentalize them to, like Hart said, the inner morality of poisoning, if you only take them as principles for efficacy or efficiency. So I do believe, like you, and I think you make the argument very clear, that you can only understand Fuller if you take the idea of reciprocity underlying all the 8 principles taken together. And what I do think, the way of solving the puzzle is a point you made in The Long Arc of Legality. I was very touched by it because it answered to many of my disquieting problems in jurisprudence. When you bring up the idea of a basic legitimation demand by Bernard Williams, I think that's the key point to solving the puzzle you propose. I do believe, like you, that the only way to solve this is bringing the legal subject into the frame, into the picture. But my question is the following. When you take Frankel and when you take the challenge by Sklar, it is very clear that the dual state did not respect all of the 8 precepts, especially the 8th principle, because there was no congruence between the law as it was promulgated and the law as it was applied. What I do have in mind is a challenge by Matthew Kramer, for instance. And again, I believe, like you, I think you are right. I think Fuller was right. But Kramer's idea basically is that you have the 8 principles, you have respect for the 8 principles, but you can very much conceive of law as the instrument of an elite of officials that benefit from the forms of law to further pursue their own self-interests. So it is not a scenario like the dual state in which the principles are not respected. In the contrary, the principles need to be respected for the self-interest of the officials to be pursued. I think the way of solving this is the idea of reciprocity. But at the same time, there is always the challenge of the legal positivist, of the unjust system of law being used to treat people as things, not as persons. So how much does an argument like yours, an argument like ours, depend on an idea of the human person? How can we... Aren't we conceding too much for the legal positivist if we accept that we do not have to discuss such ideas? I mean, we concede to legal positivism the starting point of a rule of recognition and the legal system. And I mean, they say that they are not discussing the human person. They're not trying to discuss. There's no human anthropology underlying their claims. But I think there is. And I think this needs to be brought into account for the discussion to be more complete. But how can we escape the challenge of the legal positivist that says, well, I'm not discussing this kind of thing. All you have is wishful thinking. And the fact is that we have unjust systems. And the fact is that unjust systems rely on Fuller's 8 precepts to pursue the self-interest of self-interested officials. I mean, how can we escape this theoretical puzzle, not the practical one?
I sometimes have trouble understanding what the theoretical puzzle is, but let me say something more than that. So I'll start with why I'm sometimes puzzled. If you go right to the end of Hart's 1958 lecture, or at least not right to the end, but the second last section of Positivism, the Law and Morals, where he says, well, let's consider the natural law challenge if we look not at individual laws, but look at legal orders as a whole. if we look at legal orders as a whole, do we see some connection between law and morality arising at that level? And then he has this thought experiment in there where he says, well, imagine that we weren't made as human beings are, but we were these giant crabs. Did you remember this part of Hart's 1958 lecture in the Harvard Law Review? And so if we were giant crabs and we didn't need to nourish ourselves, and so we were covered with this huge armor that meant that we were invulnerable to attack, then the law that we would have, he doesn't call it this, but crab law for these giant crabs would be very different from human law. So we can imagine this world in which things are very different, and we can see that law would be very different there. And so we can see there's no necessary connection between law and morality. And I think that raises a kind of theoretical puzzle, but not one that I care about, because I don't care about law for crabs. I care about law for human beings. And at other times, Hart says very different things. So when he gets to chapter 9 of the concept of law, and he comes up with his minimum content of natural law, he's talking about law for human beings. And then he said, well, and he'd already suggested this in the 1958 lecture. He said, well, of course, some people are going to have to get protection from the law, otherwise we wouldn't have law. If law gave no protections to anyone, you'd have a system, as he puts it in 1958, of meaningless taboos. You wouldn't have law at all. So it has to protect some, but it needn't protect all. And it can protect just a minority and oppress the majority. Well, I think if you do that, then you have second-class citizens. And that provides a resource which lawyers can use to resist the law. You can try to do something even more dramatic. And that is say, well, we're not going to create second-class citizens who will, because that will ensure that there are all sorts of tensions in the legal order, and then clever lawyers can use the law to resist the law. Rather, we're going to deem a whole class of people not to be people. So we turn them into things, we enslave them. But even that creates huge legal problems. In any legal order in which there's been the legal institution of slavery, problems arise in managing the fact that there are people there. Behold a man. And tensions arise within the legal order, which is why I'm so interested in the issue of fugitive slaves. But you probably, I'm not sure, do you have to study Roman law as students in Brazil? Yeah, so I had to study it in my day as a student in South Africa, because we had this rather strange system called Roman Dutch law. So we had this inheritance of both the Dutch settlers and the English settlers. And in Roman law, there were tremendous problems in managing the status of slavery, because enslaved people were considered as human beings for some purposes, but not for others. So it's not quite the second-class citizen situation. It's more that the enslaved people are put into something like a prerogative space, but that prerogative space is within the legal order, and that then creates tensions. And you see those tensions lurking on the margins of Hart's work. So whenever he talks about stability in the concept of law, he's very worried about groups of people being excluded in more or less dramatic ways from the protections that the legal order must offer to some. So I think I'm finally getting to an answer to the important part of your question. So did you use the term philosophical anthropology or something like that?
Yeah. I had in mind exactly the minimum content of natural law.
Yeah. So I think that people, legal positivists like Hart, like Kelsen, do operate with a philosophical anthropology. They just pretend not to, but they can't maintain that pretense all of the time. And one of the reasons why I like to go back to Hobbes is that Hobbes it doesn't try to hide this at all, right? You start off with individuals in the state of nature. There's a philosophical anthropology there. And these individuals are just pursuing their self-interest. But if they don't have the kind of social institutions that make peaceful human interaction possible, life is nasty, brutish, whatever, in short. And so they have to construct a society which will make it possible for them to interact together on peaceful terms. And so you come up with the idea of a political order, and important to that political order is a legal order. And what does that legal order do? It makes possible peaceful interaction between individuals, even though those individuals have very different ideas about what the good is. I think that is behind all of philosophy of law, if philosophy of law is about trying to understand law as a matter of authority. So you say, well, they seem to do without a philosophical anthropology. I don't think they actually manage that.
Chico, queres?
Não, se quiser fazer o rebuttal, feel free to.
I absolutely agree with you, Professor. And I would ask you, just a follow-up. Don't you think that there's the first part of the problem in that they don't recognize that their theories depend on a human anthropology? They don't want to join in that discussion, even though they cannot help it. But on a second part of the problem, isn't there a problem with the idea of human being that their theories presuppose? Because what I do have in mind is that Hart's minimum content of natural law doesn't seem to take us far enough, because his idea of the human person doesn't seem to be quite correct. Because it seems to me that he's still attached to a Hobbesian idea in many ways, even though he doesn't go all the way down. I think it's wrong for us to presuppose that the kind of things that we are leads to that idea of that minimum content of natural law. That's not enough for the type of people that we are, because that's how we are. I mean, we need to coordinate our activities. We need a lot more than just the protection of a few and the protection of the resources that we have that may run out. I mean, two problems. First, they don't recognize that they need a human anthropology, but second, their human anthropology is not quite correct. Would you agree with that, or would you still like to retrieve and reclaim Hart's minimum content of natural law as something valuable and something quite correct overall?
You like the way that I brought Bernard Williams into the philosophy of law. And Williams, as I'm sure you know, has this critique of liberal political philosophy. So it's not that he's against liberalism. He just, his critique is only that liberal political philosophers, Rawls, Dworkin, have a mistaken view. Maybe this is an unfair criticism, but there's something to it. Certainly true of Dworkin, maybe not as true of Rawls, that for them legitimacy is just the legitimacy of a liberal political order. So if you want to know what the criteria of legitimacy are, whatever the best account of liberalism gives us. And any legal order that doesn't live up, or legal and political order that doesn't live up to those criteria, is illegitimate. And Williams then observes, well, that means that there have been very few legitimate political and legal orders ever. And they actually seem to be disappearing from the world, those few. And that seems to be a kind of crazy view in a way. Why? Because there have been legal and political orders throughout history and all around the world today that are not liberal, maybe even illiberal, but are in some real way legitimate. So we need to understand legitimacy in a broader way. And then Williams says, and this is the kind of, and he's explicit about this is the Hobbesian move in Williams. He says that a political order is legitimate. It's actually political only if it solves what he says the first political question. And the first political question is securing peace, stability, and order. Then once you've secured that, you've secured the minimum conditions for an order to be legitimate. And then maybe you have to do a lot more, but that at least gives you minimum legitimacy. And I think that idea actually has something in common with Hart's minimal content of natural law. That's the starting place. It doesn't mean that that should be our resting place. But there might be a very important insight there, that this is the minimum that an order has to deliver for those who are subject to power, to be called either political, I think that's Williams's point, or in my point, legal. After that, there are all sorts of interesting questions we can ask about how best to construct such a political and legal order, but that's the issue that first has to be solved. And for that, I think we need a very thin conception of the human individual.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm more than satisfied.
Yeah.
Professor, let me take a step back. When we were discussing your book in the research group, one of the issues that were brought to the surface puzzled us. So I took notice of that, and I would like you to clarify a particular point if possible. You present us in your book with Rose's reading of Kelsen's Legal Man. He would be one who, I quote, adopts the law as his personal morality and exhausting all the norms he accepts as just, end quote. If I'm not mistaken, this is grounded on Kelsen's proposition on the pure theory of law that there's not a proper real conflict between legal norms and moral norms. But it always seemed to me that the reason for not being such a conflict is that moral and legal arguments pertain to completely different systems. So I would consider his argument as pertaining to a logical framework. So there's no conflict because the arguments pertain to completely different systems. This is not to say, I think, that there could, in Kelsen's reading, that there could not be a moral criticism of valid law. Could you clarify this point for us, please?
Quite complicated to give an answer to that question. There are two kinds of norm conflicts that Kelsen deals with. So there's a conflict between moral norms and legal norms. And there, as you say, for Kelsen, in a way, there's no conflict. That's not a puzzle for him, right? Because for him, these are two completely separate domains. And even more important for Kelsen, as an affirmed non-cognitivist when it comes to morality, he thinks that one's views about morality are entirely subjective. So that kind of conflict doesn't seem to bother him most of the time. Sometimes it does bother him some of the time. And in my book, as you have seen, I pick up some passages from work in the 1920s, where he is actually very concerned with law as a kind of ethical construction. But he tries to leave that behind as he moves on in his work. I think the problem that Kelsen is more interested in is what he regards as a genuine puzzle, and that's a conflict between different legal norms. And this has to do with his views about the relationship between international law and domestic law. And there he wants to argue that those conflicts also are only apparent conflicts, because he's an affirmed monist. He doesn't think that there are apparent conflicts, but if you have a legal order in place, that legal order will always have a way of ironing out those conflicts so as to show that there's no conflict at all. And that's a part of Kelsen I actually find very interesting, is trying to show that his claim that there can't be conflicts between legal norms is actually a claim that is worth taking seriously. Hart dismissed it altogether. It's kind of crazy. When it comes to the conflict between moral norms and legal norms, I suppose, since I'm not a non-cognitivist as Kelsen was, I think he was just wrong to think that one could sort out that issue as easily as he thought. And so I think if one dismisses Kelsen's non-cognitivism, then the conflict between moral and legal norms does become an interesting puzzle for philosophy of law. It's certainly more of a puzzle for a legal positivist like Hart, who I don't think is a non-cognitivist, although he sometimes says non-cognitivist sounding things, and for Raz, who's definitely the opposite of a non-cognitivist when it comes to morality. There's more I could say if you want to press me further, but that's at least a start of an answer to your question.
Thank you for that, Professor. I have further questions, but Gilberto, let's switch. I'll give you back the floor.
Okay. One question that has been very frequent, Professor, in the group while we are discussing your book, and in some of the criticism I have seen directed to your work, is that you seem to make a lot of effort to retrieve and to reclaim some authors, even against their own views about themselves. I mean, you are very open about it. You do it in regards to Hart, against Hart's own self-understanding, but you also recognize that you go against the orthodox reading of Hobbes, for instance, the very reading of Kelsen, as Professor Francisco was asking you about. So I myself am not a Hobbes scholar. I was very familiar with the orthodox view. So I would like to see whether what you are trying to do is to claim that this is the best reading of these authors, why there has been some interest by your part to reclaim their ideas against themselves, against this line of perhaps criticism. For example, what I have in mind is that one of the best philosophical essays I have ever read is Simone Weil's essay on the Iliad. And some people have said that she's quite anachronistic and that she's not as faithful to some translations of the Iliad. And so the discussion is on exegesis and not on the philosophical merit of her idea. So I have seen some criticism to your book that, to me, loses the basic point of the book. That's the most important one. But still, how would you respond to this? Well, why is he trying to claim that his reading of Hobbes and of Hart is better than the orthodox reading of these authors? Why so much effort into reclaiming them to make your ideas that are actually quite good on their own?
Most reviewers of my book then told me after the book was published that he had been one of the anonymous reviewers. Asked me at some point after space, why did you make us go through these tortured readings of Hobbes and then Kelsen and then Hart? Why don't you just make your arguments? And I think the answer to that is I want to show through a kind of a history of ideas that the arguments that I want to make are actually arguments from the tradition of philosophy of law. So I'm not going to claim them as my arguments, because I think one can find these arguments in the work of people who were so many levels above me that I'm really regard myself as just an interpreter of what came before me. And the clue, and you may recall this, came to me from a philosopher who I probably disagree with politically, but I think was a wonderful political philosopher, and that is Michael Oakeshott. So Oakeshott, in his essay on the rule of law, which I think is the great essay on the rule of law from the 20th century, not Raz's The Rule of Law and Its Virtue, but Oakeshott's essay on the rule of law, he says at a certain point in the essay, which is mostly influenced by Hobbes, so he's trying to extract an idea of legality from Hobbes. So actually, in line with my unorthodox reading. My unorthodox reading owes a lot to Oakeshott. He says that something like this idea of legality, I can't remember the term exactly, that he uses, lies behind the work of many so-called legal positivists. And it's the so-called that interested me. So that's in a way the inspiration for the whole book, that there's an idea of legality that and it's a bit like the answer to the question about philosophical anthropology. That's really driving the project of so-called legal positivists. But they keep trying to pretend that it's not, that it's something else, because they're worried about the consequences of accepting it. And why they're worried about the consequences, they're worried that somehow they'll be turned into a bad kind of natural lawyer who says that just because there's law there, there's something moral. So there is something, I agree, that's kind of strange about the argument of my book. And what's strange about it, you've put this much more politely than I'm about to describe it in describing my own work. But that book, from the title, depends on rereading the three main figures. So there's an unorthodox reading of Hobbes, and build on that an unorthodox reading of Hart, and an unorthodox reading of Kelsen. So I'm going against orthodoxy with three major figures. So that makes the whole project look kind of weird. But let me try to, just a quick anecdote about how this whole idea came to me. I'm half in law and half in philosophy at the University of Toronto. And most years in philosophy, I teach a class of second-year students. So these are undergraduate students, right? 19-year-olds, second year of university. It's an introduction to philosophy of law. And I put together a textbook of readings with some colleagues. And we start with Hobbes. And these are extracts that I chose from Hobbes. And I chose these extracts in order to support the orthodox reading of Hobbes, because that was the reading I accepted. And each year, some of the students who are actually doing the work would read the extracts I chose and say, but that sentence there, it doesn't fit with what you're telling us about Hobbes. And I would find what I thought were good reasons to explain to them, no, that's not right. Of course, the orthodox reading, Hobbes just is slightly misleading over there. Eventually, after getting these objections for maybe 10 years, I started to think, well, maybe I should try to make more sense of these sentences, because the students keep coming up with these sentences. And then I started to reread the whole of Hobbes in light of those sentences. Once you do that, Hobbes looks very different. And there is a lot, as you'll know, of textual work that I do in order to support the reading. So it's not just claiming that there's an interpretation that comes out of nowhere and that can be attributed to Hobbes. There's a lot of reading that goes on there. And I would say the same thing about Kelsen and Hart. I read years ago somewhere, and I've never been able to find this, and I wish I'd noted it down at the time. So I know who the author was. So the great philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, says somewhere in an essay that if you're reading an author and you come across some sentences that don't seem to fit with, let's call it, the orthodox understanding of that author, then take note of those sentences and then try to understand everything else that that person has said in light of those sentences. And that's, in a way, my interpretive strategy with all of these three figures.
That's great. Thank you for that, Professor. We actually had a lively discussion about why did you put all that effort through. Professor, as we are approaching the end of our talk, I couldn't let you leave without asking a question about constitutionalism. Your book advances the idea that a legal constitution generates political legitimacy, and you also claim that the divide between legal positivism and natural law should be replaced by a conversation about constitutionalism. I do agree with that, but what do you make of the divide between legal constitutionalists and political constitutionalists? Because, of course, constitutionalism is a disputed concept. In an orthodox view, it could be portrayed as a political theory that relies on the objective authority of law to control political power and political processes, but that's not the only view up for grabs. And a follow-up question on that would be I would like to hear you speak a little about the importance of law in order to prevent democratic regimes from eroding. This trust that, constitutional courts, you rely a lot on judges, and the relationship established between judges and the legal subjects. So the reasons that judges give to legal subjects, they should be interpretable as sound, as just. So you put a lot of importance in judges and courts. So I would ask you about constitutionalism, and I would like to hear you talk about the potential that is grounded upon law to prevent democratic backslide or democratic erosion.
So let me start with the political and the legal constitutionalists. So like the debate between legal positivists and natural lawyers, I think we should get rid of these labels because they don't really help us very much. All the political constitutionalists who think of themselves as political constitutionalists are legal constitutionalists. So let me just take the two most prominent people, Richard Bellamy in the United Kingdom and Jeremy Waldron, who's never called himself a political constitutionalist, but he's firmly allied with this view. So it's against constitutional judicial review, right? So Waldron's famous piece, The Core of the Case Against Judicial Review, it's about the kind of constitutional review that one encounters in the United States of America or in Canada, where judges have the authority to, in effect, invalidate a statute because it violates constitutional guarantees. But they're all in favor of what I call, and I talk about this in chapter 3, I think, administrative law review. Why? Because for them, something like Fuller's principle of congruence is very important. If you're going to have parliamentary supremacy, which is what they want, you can't have officials acting outside of the scope of their delegated authority. So you need at least administrative law review. You need to have officials independent of the officials who are implementing the statute to check that the officials who are implementing the statute are doing their job in accordance with the law. So they're just in favor of a different kind of legal constitution, right? They're not political constitutionalists in any sense. Who are the real political constitutionalists? The real political constitutionalist is, I think, Carl Schmitt, someone who thinks that the sovereign stands outside of the legal order. And then what you get, and this is the, for Frankel, Schmitt is the political theorist of the prerogative state. What you get is a prerogative state, the sovereign just deciding when there's an exception and how to respond to it. So I see very little difference, and this is a point that one can make using Bernard Williams. There's a great essay by a Scottish constitutional theorist called Cormac MacAimlaig, where he says that, according to Williams, whether constitutional review is legitimate or not will depend on the history and makeup of the country. So one can have a legitimate constitutional setup in the UK, which is very different from the legitimate constitutional setup in the United States of America. These are two different ways of answering the first political question. So these are all legal constitutionalists. They just differ about what the best legal constitution is, and perhaps they shouldn't make overclaim, because maybe parliamentary supremacy is better for one order and constitutional review works better in another. I generally, as it happens, tend to favor parliamentary supremacy. I'm not a great fan of constitutional review. So that's the first part of the answer to the question, and in answering it, I think I've forgotten the second part of your question, so maybe you could just remind me of it.
I asked about your reliance, about how far can law go in order to protect liberal democracy.
Yeah. Okay, now I remember. So let me go back to where I in particular started, and that is as a politics and law student in apartheid South Africa, in a system where there was parliamentary supremacy and a kind of democracy, but only for whites. And even there, in that highly oppressive, unjust political order, law did provide a kind of protection for all, not just for the minority, not just for the white minority. So I've been interested ever since then in what kind of protection law provides, just in there being a legal order there. Even if it's not democratic, it seems to give those who are subject to the power of the state something. So what does it give them? And I do think that as long as legal order is maintained, it does provide a kind of guarantee against democratic backsliding. And in order to slide back, one actually has to do damage to legal order. So I think that the lesson that authoritarian sorts have learnt around the world from Viktor Orban in Hungary is how you can hollow out law from within. And what happens is you get the growth of these prerogative spaces within the legal order. And I think eventually one will get to a tipping point where you cease to have a prerogative space problematically located within the legal order, and you get something like a dual state. And that's why I find Frankel's analysis so interesting, because it does tell you there's a kind of tipping point. And just one last remark, the project I'm working on now, well, actually, I'm always working on the same project. I'm always working on the rule of law and the kind of intersection between political philosophy and constitutional theory. And the project I'm working on now focuses on the UK. And as you might know, in the UK, virtually the last act of the Conservative government before they were kicked out in the last general election was to enact a statute called the Rwanda Statute. And the Rwanda Act required that asylum seekers who landed in the UK would be sent to Rwanda to have their asylum claims processed. The only way to achieve that was to remove legal protections from asylum seekers, to the point where the lawyers who were making the arguments in favor of this measure, who mostly lawyers in public lawyers in Oxford, wanted to exclude judicial review altogether. And if you exclude judicial review altogether, you put asylum seekers into much the same situation, I think, as fugitive slaves were in the United States. That if you managed to arrive in the north, you were rendered back in a summary proceeding to the south. And I think that the Rwanda statute, but it's going to take me a whole book to make this argument, despite the fact that there was a very clear deportation rule, if you arrived in the UK, you would be sent to Rwanda, was in flagrant violation of the rule of law. And what this shows me is that if you want to slide back from democracy, you actually do damage not only to political order, but to legal order. If you use law in this way, you actually do damage to the fabric of legal order.
That's brilliant, Professor. Thank you for that. We don't want to overextend our welcome. So, Gilberto, I'll give it back to you for your final remarks.
Yeah, I don't think we have time for any extra questions, so I would just have to thank Professor Dyzenhaus for being with us here today. It was indeed brilliant. Like I said, I am suspect because I already agree in advance with what he has said, because I am very much in agreement with his book, with his overall project, and I am a bit of a monomaniac with the rule of law as well. And the one thing I would just add finally, I don't think there's time for you to answer completely, Professor, is just that you mentioned briefly two authors. One of them you mentioned in one of your responses to Professor Francisco. You mentioned Jeremy Waldron. I would be very curious to see what you have to say about Waldron's proposal of understanding together the idea of law and the rule of law. His famous essay called The Concept and the Rule of Law. You cannot understand any of these ideas if you don't take them together into consideration. And the one extra question I would have is that in the final portion of your book, already in the appendix, you mentioned that you don't engage with John Finnis because you think he has a perhaps reactionary conception of the human good that understands the good as extra legal. Can't we make an unorthodox reading of Finnis as well, just as you make an unorthodox reading of Hobbes and Kelsen and Hart, and maybe utilize his first two chapters of natural law and natural rights without all the reactionary trimmings we have if you take into consideration his overall theory? I mean, if you could just say a few words about that. If you don't have time, of course, I understand. It's just I couldn't miss the opportunity.
I could say a few words about that. So, first of all, Jeremy Waldron. So Waldron is someone I generally find inspirational. There's very little I disagree with Waldron about. So I think so Waldron, as you might know, comes from New Zealand. Yeah, and he likes to provoke people in North America, and he's very good at provoking people in North America. So the core of the case against judicial review is a kind of provocation, because most US legal scholars just take constitutional judicial review for granted. But he's fully in favor of legality. He's fully in favor of judicial review as long as it's the right kind of judicial review. And his work on the rule of law, in particular on the way that he draws connections between the rule of law and democratic theory, I think is brilliant. And I think one of the best essays on Fuller ever written, I don't know whether you've read this essay, it's not in my book, is his essay where he actually is very harsh about Hart's critique of Fuller. He really accuses Hart of complete dishonesty in that essay. So that's Waldron. Finnis, this book that I'm writing now about the Rwanda statute is largely focused on Finnis, because Finnis is the leader of the group of Oxford public lawyers who've made the extreme right-wing arguments in the last few years, which one of whose results was the Rwanda statute. And there's an explicit alliance between Finnis and the people in Oxford working with him, mostly a fellow called Richard Eakins, and Adrian Vermeulen in Harvard, who's a disciple of Carl Schmitt. And these links then go from Oxford to Harvard to extreme right-wing figures in Poland and in Hungary. And there is this movement among public lawyers, which goes under the title of common good constitutionalism, which I think is in a bid to bring back a kind of authoritarian, even fascist kind of rule. So of course there are bits of Finnis that don't seem to lead there, but what I'm interested in is those parts of Finnis that actually provide the groundwork for this kind of political and legal view. So that is actually a big part of my current project, is talking about Finnis and those associated with him.
I already admired your work, and now all the more so. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Gilberto. And as we approach the end, Professor Dyzenhaus, let me just say once again, stress this point that we do not take at all for granted the opportunity to have a lively discussion with one of the top scholars in legal theory and constitutional theory in the globe. And we are so glad that you took the time to share your thoughts with us, to share some beautiful Berlin afternoon of work with us today. So we are very, very, very happy to have you here. So thank you very much. I'll give it back to you for your final remarks.
Let me close by saying two thank yous. So first of all, thank you for making the effort with your group to read my book. I'm completely sincere when I say that makes me really happy. And an occasion like this to talk to people who are interested in my work and in the ideas that interest all of us is always a valuable opportunity to me. So I want to thank you for that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor David. Thank you, Gilberto. Thank you, everyone, for holding on to the end. Eu desejo bom dia para todos e para todos. Muito obrigado e até a próxima. See you next time. Bye bye.